Welcome everyone to this night event of the experimental lab of the LILAC department, which is the third seminar of the cycle Language Data Are Waiting, Methods, Techniques, Resources. I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker for today's workshop, Professor Tan Slobin, Emeritus Professor of Psychology and Linguistics at the University of California at Berkeley. I won't even try to summarize Dan's scientific achievements, not just for the obvious reason that he needs little introduction, but because tonight he will be the one to retrace his 60-year career for us. He will guide us on a very fascinating journey through research questions and methods, from child language to cognition to linguistic typology. The mapping of concepts and linguistic expressions is at the heart of this journey. So tonight we will learn a lot about the thinking for speaking perspective. I don't want to waste precious time, so I immediately give the floor to you, Dan, not before thanking you for accepting our invitation despite the huge time difference. Thank you very much.
Molto grazie. Buonasera a tutti in Bologna. I will go on in English, but I wish I could do it in Italian. Welcome to my study in Berkeley. Here it's morning, sunny morning. I'm looking out at the blue of San Francisco Bay, the gold of the Golden Gate Bridge. But frankly, I would rather be with all of you in Bologna, followed by good talk and food and drink afterwards. But this is the best we can do. So Caterina, Francesca has told you what she's asked me to do. And I realize that to talk about a 60-year career in less than 2 hours is really difficult. But fortunately, your interests all deal with language and cognition in adults. The first half of my career deals with child language, and I will point to that only briefly to show how it led to the frog story and research following from the frog story. So that's, I think, an interesting path. And when you look back over a long career, you begin to see a narrative thread, or you create a narrative thread, so it begins to all hang together. Undoubtedly, I won't have time to say everything I want to say, so I prepared a handout for all of you, and you have here my email, and I welcome anyone to ask me questions, to carry on conversation by email, and you can find, I think, all of these papers at this website. So I will begin at the very beginning, because thinking back about this, I realized that my earliest childhood is really relevant to the interests that I've followed all of my life. I grew up in an immigrant multilingual family in Detroit, Michigan. My mother and her family, in fact, escaped from Soviet Ukraine exactly a century ago, just about 1920, escaping from anti-Semitic pogroms carried out both by Russians and Ukrainians, escaping first to Moldova, which was then part of Romania. So this whole path is very familiar to me for personal memory and for the tragedies that are going on again a century later in the very same terrain. But they made their way to Detroit, Michigan. I grew up speaking English as a native language, but there was a lot of Yiddish, Hebrew, and Russian in the household. In fact, my mother taught me and my brother to read and write Yiddish when we were quite young, about 7 or 8 years old, and later modern Hebrew. The family was secular, non-religious, but Hebrew as a spoken language was important to them. Then when I was 14, my father got a Fulbright to spend a year in Austria, and I was thrown into a gymnasium in Vienna and learned German without knowing how it happened. Later on, in 1959, I was one of the student guides at the first American exhibition in Moscow, and sort of thaw between Khrushchev and Eisenhower at that point. And so I was thrown into speaking Russian constantly. And also I had Spanish here because in high school I took 3 years of Spanish, and one of my best friends was Mexican American, and I spent a lot of time in his home talking Spanish with his monolingual grandparents. So my head was full of all of these languages. And already when I was a teenager, I had a kind of insight. I look back on this as a kind of epiphany. I remember I was walking along and realizing I was thinking with no words in my head. And I had the insight that I could express these thoughts in any of the languages I knew. That already showed me a disconnect between language and cognition. That unfortunately, most monolingual Americans don't understand. So I think you will have noticed, all of you who have had a struggle with using English as a second language, that if you read all of the cognitive science coming from the United States and artificial intelligence and theories of mind, they all seem to take for granted that the mind is structured like the structure of English, and the concepts are the concepts of English vocabulary items. So I've always encouraged my students to learn another language, and if possible, a language that's very different from their own. So I was at the University of Michigan. It was absolutely boring then. It was the last years of American behaviorism, where psychology was only stimulus response learning theory. And then there was an event of very good luck. I think when you look back at your life, you find these lucky accidents, a serendipity, you can call it. I went to Harvard for graduate school in 1960, and that was exactly when the cognitive revolution was beginning, there and then at Harvard and MIT. And I was a graduate student in the new Center for Cognitive Studies. And essentially, what I've been trying to do ever since was shaped by my teachers. I think when you look back, you see how much you were trying to carry out the program of your various teachers, but to put them together in your own personality. And it was an absolutely remarkable combination of these mentors. Jerome Bruner, a cognitive and perceptual psychologist who had gotten interested in child development through working with Piaget. George Miller, one of the very first psycholinguists working with speech perception and comprehension. Linguistics came from the radical new work of Noam Chomsky and from the traditional work in morphology of Roman Jakobson. Roger Brown was just beginning to record children in their homes and study their speech, which had never been done before. And Eric Lenneberg taught the first course on biological foundations of language, which was a brand new field then. Except for Jakobson, all of these mentors were in their 30s and 40s. And I had just turned 20, so it was an exceedingly exciting time. And I don't want to spend much time on the child language work, but I want to briefly point to my doctoral dissertation because it shows that already I had a discomfort between looking only at syntax as the core of language. We were using reaction time as a response, and since part of what I've been invited to talk about is methods, I want to remind you of this traditional 19th century psychological method. In psycholinguistics, you present someone with an utterance and a situation and ask them to respond quickly, usually by pushing a true or a false button, whether the utterance is true or false in relation to the situation. And we had been using active and passive sentences, questions and answers, affirmative and negative, counting the number of syntactic transformations according to Chomsky, and we found that, for example, it took people longer to decide if a passive sentence was true or false than an active sentence, and the explanation was because they had to go through these syntactic steps. But I saw there was a problem with this research, and this was a design I used in my dissertation. The pictures we were presenting were things like this, a dog chasing a cat, which I called reversible because it's also possible that the cat could chase the dog. So if you hear a sentence like the cat is being chased by the dog, you have to really figure out which one is chasing. And in fact, this is reaction time. Reaction time is slower for these passive sentences. But I realized something had been left out. There are what I call non-reversible situations, like this picture. The girl is watering the plants, and you would not say the plants are watering the girl. And here, there was no difference in reaction time to deciding if the passive was true or false. So already I had the feeling that a full model of language processing had to include not only syntax, but semantics and world knowledge. So that was sort of the opening wedge to what has motivated all of my research since then. Then I had another good stroke of good fortune. Psycholinguistics was a brand new field. There were no courses, no textbooks. The University of California had contacts at Harvard, and they said, do you have anyone who could teach a psycholinguistics course? So I was sent to Berkeley as a young man, it's 24, given an assistant professorship, and it was just pure good luck. I've remained here ever since, so this has been just the right place for my career. And here I was thrown in with another group of mentors, also young faculty members in their 30s and 40s, and adding the social science context. So John Gumper's anthropologist, Irving Goffman, a sociologist, Susan Irvin Tripp, a social psychologist who turned out to be one of the founders of the field of sociolinguistics. So we were meeting with graduate students from these fields, and I was making claims about how language development is the same everywhere because I had already started reading various diary studies. In fact, I got started reading diary studies by Roman Jakobson, who, knowing my interest in child language and knowing that I spoke Russian, one day said to me, here is a great big book by Gvozdiev, a Russian linguist who kept a daily diary of his son's language development, and it's full of analysis of the acquisition of Russian. And I saw, wow, the Russian-speaking child has a very different morphosyntactic problems to solve, but it's talking about the same kinds of things. But the anthropology graduate students in this working seminar said, well, you know, you're making generalizations just about Western educated, middle-class literate children. How can you make claims about universality? We should really go to the field and study language acquisition in a number of other places. So we agreed, and we made a bargain with them that we would spend a year writing a field manual about just what they should look for, and then they went to the field for a year and brought back child language studies from Samoa, from Kenya, from Mayan-speaking Mexico, from tribal language in India, and also from California. And I edited this field manual, which I just want to give you the title because this shows you already the tenor of the research and how different already the West Coast was from the formal syntax of the East Coast. It was cross-cultural, not cross-linguistic study, and it was the acquisition of communicative competence rather than syntactic competence, which was Chomsky's term, linguistic competence or syntactic competence. From that, I got a feeling for both the universals and the particulars. The fieldworkers came back and said, well, in all of these different places, children learn to speak at roughly the same timetable, whether they're spoken to by caring adults or whether they learn language in groups of children by overhearing, whether they're literate or not literate. And there's no place where 3-year-olds already know the whole language or where 5-year-olds are still struggling to work it out. So I went on formulating ideas about universals of language acquisition, studying all of the available diary studies. Here was a list of all of the diary studies that were available, and you see there was quite a range of parents all over keeping track of their children's language development. But I decided I had to find out for myself, so I took my first sabbatical to spend a year in Turkey, and that changed my view of everything. again, one of those lucky accidents, because I really picked Turkey because my wife and I were interested in Byzantine and Islamic architecture, something I've been writing about now in retirement. But learning Turkish changed my ideas about language entirely because its structure is totally different from all of the Indo-European languages that I knew. In fact, English, German, Spanish, Russian, they just seemed like dialects of one another in relation to Turkish. So all of this work led to an acquisition model that I called operating principles, a set of algorithms that children might learn to discover grammar, but still assuming that the underlying course of cognitive development, according to Piaget, would be the same regardless of the language. So you'll see that the frog story later on in my career led me to a major revision towards linguistic relativity and the kinds of questions that I think many of you are interested in now. So after all of this work, my students and colleagues and I decided we really have to do systematic experimental work. It's fine to have all of these naturalistic observations and a sort of anthropological framework to have diary studies, but we wanted to actually be able to elicit production and comprehension in a range of languages. So we had a big project. We picked 4 languages which differed on a number of dimensions, word order, inflectional systems, language type, and also because we had people that we could work with, colleagues or students. And so we carried out this language in 4 places, in Berkeley, in Rome, in Dubrovnik, in Istanbul. So this is where Italian enters in. This was the language we called Serbo-Croatian then. I guess now, since we studied it in Dubrovnik, it should be called Croatian, and Turkish. We set up a cross-sectional micro-longitudinal design where we worked with groups of children between the ages of 2 and 4, and a whole battery of tests, cognitive tests, language measures, eliciting both speech and comprehension. Many, many interesting findings, which would be part of a major lecture about child language. But since I'm just moving through this to today's topic, I will point out only that we were especially interested, I was especially interested in locatives, eliciting how children would use locative constructions, placing one object in another or describing its location, or talking about dynamic scenes, movements, locative movements. And that already led me to the conclusion that in each language, a child has to figure out what is being encoded in my language and what are the means for doing this. And it was clear that the morphosyntactic complexity of the languages influenced how much trouble it took the child to figure out how to use the full system. Over the years, I was involved with students and collaborators in many places. Here you can see the places where we carried out research. And I myself did research in a number of languages and places that you see on the map. This one is Hebrew. The Netherlands is both Dutch and sign language of the Netherlands, because the whole later phase of my career was working on sign language, which is, again, a different lecture. And here to the United States for both English and American Sign Language. So that was the framework. And at the same time, in the background to this lecture, every now and then I'll give you a slide in this frame showing in the background, which I'm calling the sidetrack. I wanted to have systematic data on how children acquire different kinds of languages. So we had a workshop and arranged a set of guidelines saying, when you who know about the acquisition of a particular language, tell us about its grammar, what are early errors, what are easy to learn, what are these social contexts, and so on. And we assembled people who were actually working on languages. We had a series of workshops in Berkeley that led to these 5 volumes that you may know about between the years of 1985 to 97, And in the end, we have data, good data on the acquisition of 28 different languages, so you see of many different structures. But that also was shaping my ideas about the role of linguistic typology, which has become a major focus of my attention, linguistic typology related to language and thought. So the question became how children acquire languages of different types, and how learning and speaking a language of a particular type influences attention, memory, narration of events. This led to this huge theoretical revision that I mentioned, where my focus then was on linguistic relativity rather than universality. And this was pushed especially by years I spent working at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, another group of influencers on me, the cognitive anthropology group of Stephen Levinson, who was doing systematic experiments on language and cognition in a huge range of areas, and the related work of Melissa Bowerman on child language acquisition. And we did a lot of things together. And as a bridge to the frog story, I just want to briefly show one set of studies that made me think differently about locative location and placement. So this is a schematism of many different scenes that one could look at. You can think of an object in a container or on a surface, and you can think of it simply being located there, static scene or a dynamic scene where you put the object to the location. And then we had child language data, naturalistic data, and comprehension data from a number of languages. I'll just give you some. And here's where the linguistic relativity comes in. So a child learning Spanish can use the one locative preposition en for all of these scenes, whether the cup is en la mesa or you put it en la mesa and so on, it's exactly the same. Child learning Turkish has to make a different split. Containment and support are not distinguished. The distinction is static versus dynamic, whether you're saying it's located at, so this would be, if you're talking about the cup, it's masada. I picked this because Turks borrowed actually the Portuguese word for table, masada. And if you're putting it on the table, it's masaya. So you have to distinguish masada, masaya. But containment and support don't matter. It's the same for both of these scenes. Whereas children learning Hindi have exactly the opposite problem. They mark containment and support differently, but static and dynamic are marked by the same inflectional forms. And then if you look at children learning Finnish, they have a different case inflection for all four locative situations. So this led to some findings that have disappeared from the screen for some reason. Oh, I see, I don't have animations on this access this way. So the finding was that children could easily learn two-way splits, either between static and dynamic or between surface or containment. But where there was a four-way split, as in Finland, this caused problems, and at first the children paid attention only to the dynamicity, in a location or moving to a location. So we began to see that common problems were solved in different ways, given the morphosyntax and the lexical constraints of the language. So now that brings me to the frog story. And again, I see that there's no way to do animations in this presentation. So I will have to talk about the points that you would have seen if I had access to my slides in the traditional way. But so it is. Another bit of serendipity, an Israeli colleague, Ruth Berman, a linguist, was spending a year in Berkeley. We did a joint seminar on temporality. We were interested in how languages talk about temporal differences, looking both at the linguistics and at speech and literature in those languages. And she was especially interested in the contrast between Hebrew and English, because English is full of these aspectual distinctions. We don't just say, he went yesterday, we said he was going, or he had going, or he had gone, or he has been going, or he will have gone. We actually have this complex combination of perfect, progressive, and tense, where we have 16 possible combinations, and all of you who've had to learn English know that this is a nuisance, although English-speaking children don't worry about this. As opposed to Hebrew, which simply has tense and no aspect. You simply say, he went, he goes, he will go. So we wanted to compare how children deal with these different systems. And after this year together in Berkeley, I went to Tel Aviv with a set of research tools to try out. One of them was a film that Wally Chafe, a linguist at Berkeley, I think you see all these things on your handout if you have handouts, a huge set of studies called the PAIR films, or the PAIR studies. He had created a film with a rather complicated scene of somebody picking pears and a boy coming and stealing the pears. It was great for eliciting narratives from adults in many different languages and cultures, but we realized it was not appropriate for children because you had to remember the story and then retell it, and that was a big memory burden because we were starting with children as young as 3. There were picture stories available. The most widely used one was this set of pictures that Maya Hickman developed in Lyon for comparing French children's French and English and several other languages acquisition of agency and movement. They were very simple stories that we didn't think would engage children well enough, and didn't seem to be this kind of story that would have the kind of universal appeal, because we wanted a device that we could eventually use in many different languages. And here again, serendipity, a graduate student of mine, Michael Bomberg, had discovered the frog story, the frog book that I think many of you know about. And this became our research tool. Here I've put this picture up for amusement. This is the two of us looking at frog story corpora in Nijmegen, Max Planck, in 1984. So you see how I looked a very long time ago, and what it was like to deal with computer output then. There were no screens to deal with. You had to print out these long fold-out screens of paper, and it looks like we're studying medieval manuscripts. But he did a dissertation. He had picked the frog story because he wanted something that he could use actually with German speakers, because he was a German student from Germany, where a parent would tell a story to a child, and then you would see how the child would retell the story. And the frog book was perfect, and I'll tell you in a minute why. But I want to point out his dissertation committee. It was this triumvirate that I had been so influenced in when I first came to Berkeley: Susan Irvin Tripp, myself, and John Gumpers. So again, you will have to look at your handout for Michael's reasons for picking the frog story.
But Ben, sorry
yes.
for interrupting. I'm posting the slides on the chat. Those that look empty, I'm posting them on the chat so that people can look at them.
Oh, perfect. I can't see them either, but I will try to remember them.
Okay.
But thanks, Francesca. That helps the audience. So picture book narration is good because you have a standard story that you're presenting to everyone. And the beauty of the frog story, it's one of a series of wonderful picture books by Mercer Mayer, in that it tells a very clear story in 24 pictures with no words. And anyone going through this, from a 2-year-old to an old person, can see that there's an event going on. And it's a very good story for our purposes because it has temporal things. There are a number of events happening simultaneously. There are punctual and durative events. There's a lot of movement from place to place in various manners and a lot of cause movement. So it was really ideal for our purposes. Now, how do I get to the next? Okay. So I've sort of quickly summarized. I think you have more on the screen than I've said. But the focus now is on linguistic typology, using the frog story now as this wonderful research tool. It's, any of you who use it, it's great. You just have this little book and you can take it anywhere. It doesn't require any equipment. You can easily Xerox the pictures and present them any way you want. So we ended up with 5 contrasting languages, again, for typological reasons. English and Hebrew, the original pair, German, Michael Bomberg added, and Spanish and Turkish from my interests. And we dealt with 4 different domains of organization of events and narratives. This is the focus of the research from here on, how are events organized when you want to talk about them. And I will deal today only with 2 domains, temporality briefly, and then spend most of the time on paths of motion, which became sort of my obsession for the next decades of my work. This led to a book that some of you may know about, the first frog story book relating events and narrative, with these participants from a number of languages. And in the domain of temporality, again, we were interested in aspectual marking, and we have these 3 contrasting languages here, marking aspect by imperfectives, by progressives, or with no marking at all. So we wanted to see what happens in a language where you have durative marking versus no durative marking to mark the temporal contour of an event. And you can see that these come from different genetic typological groups, and that I will tell you as I go along, turns out not to be a useful way to pick languages for typological contrasts. You do not want to attend to genetic typology, but here just simply if you pick 2 Germanic Indo-European languages, they fall into different categories with regard to temporality. So now consider this scene. For those of you who don't know the frog story, the boy had a pet frog who ran away. He and his pet dog go looking for the frog, and they have many adventures. At this point, the boy has climbed a tree and looked in a hole. An owl comes out and frightens him. The boy falls down. The dog has shaken down a beehive, and the bees are all chasing the dog. So we have a punctual event here. The boy falls to the ground, and a durative event. The bees are chasing the dog. And if we look at these languages, for the 3 languages with temporal marking, the 2 events are described differently. You have some way of saying the boy fell and the boy ran with some kind of durative marking, with a progressive or imperfective. Whereas in these 2 languages, German and Hebrew, they simply say the boy fell and the dog ran. Making no distinction, very rarely an adult speaker might say the boy fell and the dog runs, sort of implying that this is an ongoing event, or even less frequently, few adults would say the boy fell and the dog ran and ran, to sort of give some extent. So there are ways of extending events in these languages, but if you look at the data, they are not chosen. These are just adult narrators. We're asking what proportion of them used different tense aspect forms for the verbs fall and run. And you see for Spanish, English, and Turkish, almost all adults used different tense aspect forms. And for German and Hebrew, very few use different tense aspect forms. So that is all I want to say about my own work on temporality, because I moved on, as I said, to study location and movement. But since you're interested in methodology, I want to point out another set of methods which has turned out to be very fruitful, and I'll return to it again with regard to location and movement. This is the use of eye movement, because techniques of studying eye movement patterns can show us what a person is attending to while looking at a picture or a video, or while speaking, or both. This was begun in Heidelberg by Christiane von Stutterheim and Mary Carroll, using the eye movement technique to study languages with and without a spectral marking of durativity across many languages. And it was carried on in projects in Amsterdam by Monique Fleck, and I've given you the links to them. I'll just give you one example from their work. This is a little video clip where you see two people walking along a road, and you only see them walk this far and the clip stops. And if you ask English speakers to describe the clip, they will say something like, two women are walking down a path. So this English progressive. German speakers tend to say, zwei Frauen laufen zu einem Haus, walk to a house. English speakers don't talk about the house, they talk about the movement. The German speakers talk about the goal, and in a lot of other studies of change of state, German speakers focus towards end state, and English speakers focus on process. Now, the brilliant part of this research, for the point that I want to make, is that they took other groups of speakers and they just said, look at these videos, we will talk about them later. So they did not have to phrase them in language, they simply had to look at them. And here the eye movements are really interesting. These little arrows show English eye movements. The English eyes move along the path. German eye movements look directly to the end point. So you can see already that this first hint that I want to give you about linguistic relativity. When you are experiencing the world, you're experiencing it unthinkingly, unconsciously, in terms of the categories that are encoded in your language, the things you have learned habitually to pay attention to. If you're a German speaker, you automatically pay attention to the end of a path, the end of a process. If you're an English speaker, you pay attention to what is going on. And I will now, turning to temporality, say if you're an English speaker, you also pay attention to the manner of walking. And if you remember the previous slide, it doesn't say the women are going, it says the women are walking. It tells you something about their manner of movement. So now on to paths of motion. I'm concerned here with directed motion. A path is moving from one place in a direction to another one. And the linguistic expressions available across the range of languages that I've looked at are path verbs, like the Latinate verbs in English, or the Romance verbs like enter, entrare. Manner verbs about manner of movement, like walk and run, with path specification outside of the verb, like towards, to, from, into, and so on. And here I've relied heavily on the typology set out by my good friend and Berkeley colleague, Leonard Talmy, that I'm sure you've all heard about, where he divides languages into two types, according to where path is talking about. Languages where path is framed by the verb, he calls these verb-framed languages. Here, the main verb in a clause tells you the direction of the path, and languages that he calls satellite-framed, where the path is framed by something outside of the verb, like a path particle that he calls a satellite. For those of you who aren't English speakers, you have encountered lots of English manner verbs, and just to amuse you, my students collect these signs for me. This is a sign from the San Diego Zoo, and you can see this huge collection of verbs that probably you haven't quite figured out what's the difference between traipse, meander, or or trudge and march and so on. But it turns out that English three-year-olds know all these verbs and can act them out. This was a brochure I received in the mail saying you better do something quickly, and you can see again the verbs scurry, scoot, skedaddle. So that's the domain of manner of motion that has now obsessed me for years and years of research, beginning with the frog story. So back to the frog story again. We at this scene. This is the scene just before what I showed you, where the boy has climbed the tree and he's looking in the hole. And the next thing that happens is the scene that you have seen. But now I want to focus not on the falling, but on the owl. The owl has emerged from the hole. And how is this talked about by narrators using different kinds of languages? So languages that use path verbs, the verb-framed languages, and I will from now on put these in blue as the cool languages, in contrast, you'll see, to the warmer or hotter languages. They all use a verb that means exit, and here I've added Japanese to add another kind of verb-framed language. And across all of these languages, there is simply a main verb, which is a path verb, that means exit. There can be other expressions about the source or about the deictic direction, but the main verb is only a verb of exiting. Now, if we look at I'm trying to get these slides to move. There we are. If we look at the languages that use manner verbs with some specification of path, the satellite-framed languages, and I've included Chinese, although I will show you later that I'm not sure these are satellites, but Chinese is a serial verb language where you have slots for manner and path and deixis, always in this order, so you can put everything together in one expression. And in these languages, you get all these manner verbs: pop, flutter, jump, fly, with some kind of particle. German Haus as a prefix, or Russian V as a prefix, English out as a verb particle. So here will be using orange for the languages that care about manner, and blue for the languages that don't. So the question then that motivates my research for the next years is, why is I've just lost my screen. Hello, come back. Where is my screen? Why has this happened? Okay, sorry. So why is the same motion event reported differently in different languages? And here you see the strength of the frog story, because we know it was the same motion event. Now I have to this sort of technical back talk to myself is inevitable. So the theme is that there's an interaction here between typology and processing. You can't just look at one or the other. And the claim of all of this research is that linguistic typology organizes the perspective that you naturally take on an event. And the typology of the language asks you, what is the most natural way to talk about path? And once you've decided that, what are the consequences for talking about manner? So here's a quick tutorial in these terms. This is a scene where there's a simple single communicative intent of children moving along a path to the interior of a school. In a verb frame language, or what I sometimes call a path in verb construction, I'm giving you English and Spanish. Spanish works like Italian, as you know. The children enter the school, main verb of entrar, and in English they go into the school, so the path is here. in the what I sometimes call the non-verb, because I think there's more involved than just what Talmy calls satellites. If you add a modification of manner, here you have to add an additional expression. So, entran a la escuela corriendo, you have to use a gerundive form because the finite main verb is still dedicated to path. Whereas in English, you get manner for free because you have to have some main verb, and you can put anything you want in here. You can have they run in, they scamper in, they dash in, which I think is the reason why English and verb frame and satellite frame languages over time have this great proliferation of manner verbs, because they're so easily accessible, as opposed to not easily accessible in this language type, in the type that you Italian speakers have grown up with. So now we have frog stories from most of the Indo-European languages. And now back to typology. We have frog stories from the three major typological groupings. But I want to emphasize now that you have to pick functional typological categories, not genetic, and you pick these on the basis of the research task that you are concerned with. So if you're concerned with studying aspect marking, temporal marking, here you'll find two languages in different genetic groupings, as I've already shown you, that have a grammaticized progressive. And here you have another group of languages that have a grammaticized imperfective, all of the Romance languages, all of the Slavic languages, but not English. So this is sort of a functional typological way of selecting Indo-European languages if you want to study this category of aspect marking. If you're interested in path and manner in verb-framed and satellite-framed languages, then all of the Romance languages fall into one category and all of the Germanic and Slavic languages fall into another. So again, topic by topic, if you're interested in agency or any number of other issues, you would have to pick different kinds of functional typological groupings. So now back to the frog story with this framework in mind. This is the scene we just looked at of the owl exiting, and this simply asks what percentage of narrators used a manner of motion verb, like pop or flutter or fly, to talk about the owl's exit. And you see in the verb-framed languages, the path and verb language, virtually never. A few occasional uses in Italian, very few in Hebrew, even though they could have added manner of motion as a gerundive or as an additional phrase. But the important thing here is this punctual event of emerging. Whereas in all of the satellite languages, you have some attention to manner. I've included Mandarin and Thai here to include serial verb languages. And there are interesting reasons why there are differences here between Dutch, German, and English, and why Russian is the highest. That would be another lecture of the morphosyntactic constraints on expression of manner. But this is the theme that I want to follow from here on. As I said, again, this is another one of these sidetracks. I won't talk about my attempts to revise Talmy's typology, although my proposal of equipolently framed languages has led to a lot of research, and my rephrasing in terms of path in verb versus path not in main verb, PIV and PIN constructions has led to kind of diachronic research. You can file that away. And I won't have time to talk about the interesting interactions that emerged from comparing narratives across languages, an interaction between manner of motion and boundary crossing. So it turns out that the task gets more complicated when you look at the kind of motion event that you're dealing with. If any of you want to correspond with me later, of course, I'll be happy to do with that. But my focus from now on is what I call manner salience, driven by this strange finding that no speaker of a verb-framed language ever said that the owl exited flying, although this was possible in all of those verb-framed languages. This led to now to a whole new cycle of research on manner salience, which I will define as you look at all of the motion event descriptions in a text and you say what proportion of them have a manner verb. And I will show you that we've now been dealing with many different kinds of texts. And there are these processing factors that I think make manner highly codable in high manner salient languages. Manner is expressed in a finite verb rather than a non-finite verb. So if you are committed to using the main verb for something other than path, it's easily to accept, we know psycholinguistically, it's easier to express a finite verb than a non-finite form like running or a phrase. A single word is easier to access than a phrase or a clause like crawl in versus enter on all fours. And a fixed syntactic position makes manner highly accessible either as the main verb or as a fixed slot in a serial verb construction. Now we can look at the whole world. We now have frog stories from all of these non-Indo-European languages. And I want to add now a note about culture. It's been pointed out correctly that the frog story is not an appropriate method for many of these cultures where we worked, where children don't have experience with picture storybooks or adults don't deal with picture storybooks, where narration from pictures is not a common thing. But nonetheless, we do get descriptions of these events picture by picture, and that reveals much of the lexicon and constructions that are preferred in those languages. So the frog story is useful, even if we're not always succeeding in eliciting narrative structure, we succeed in eliciting descriptions of motion and location. So looking now at frog stories, I can show you a larger sample that have high manner salience, including here Finno-Ugric languages, two different kinds of serial verb languages from East and Southeast Asia. And for low manner salience, we can add Mayan languages, various Amerindian languages here, studying Inuit, West Greenlandic, and Japanese and Basque. So we're now moving across traditional genetic typology, and we can ask, what is going on with manner salience? This and many cultural studies and discourse studies led to the second volume. Notice the subtitle here is Typological and Contextual Perspectives. This volume 2 was edited by Sven Strömquist in Sweden and Ludo Verhoeven in the Netherlands, two psycholinguists who developed this research along with us. And all of this research led me to what is perhaps my best known formulation, thinking for speaking. And this was my objection to American cognitive scientists who say language is not interesting because people think the same everywhere, and language is just a notation system for thought. As I've already suggested from what I've done so far, language is doing more than notating what you're thinking about. It's guiding you to attend to certain dimensions rather than others. So in 1987, actually, at the Linguistic Society of America meeting, I came to this formulation, which I still think says exactly what I want to say. And so I'll read my old definition of thinking for speaking. The activity of thinking takes on a particular quality when it is employed in the activity of speaking. So notice I'm talking about thinking and speaking, not thought and language. I think much of the problem in this research is to essentialize two entities, thought and language, and ask how they relate, where in fact they're not entities, they're processes. they're thinking and speaking that go on in time and relate to each other. In the evanescent time frame, the rapidly fading time frame of constructing utterances in discourse, one fits one's thoughts into available linguistic forms. A particular utterance is never a direct reflection of objective or perceived reality, or of an inevitable and universal mental representation of a situation. This is evident within any given language because the same situation can be described in different ways. This was pointed to me with great emphasis by my colleague Paul Kay, a linguistic anthropologist at Berkeley, who said, look, even in speaking English, you can take different perspectives on events given the resources that English makes available to you. And this is evident across languages because each language provides a limited set of options for grammatical encoding of characteristics of objects and events. Thinking for speaking involves picking characteristics that fit some conceptualization of the event and are readily encodable in the language. So that's the psycholinguistic factor of accessibility. So that's been my guiding framework ever since, and I won't talk about that again. But for the next period, I moved on then from child language to thinking and speaking more generally, concerned primarily with text speaking produced by adults, not concerned very much with the developmental question. And my first puzzle so in the course of time, there were many research tools that I've used. For today, I will highlight only some of them. Creative writing and translation of writing, contact between languages, how people create event labels in experimental situations, mental imagery, what do you picture in your mind after hearing a report, what do you remember of it, and back to eye movements. If I can get through all of this quickly, I doubt it, but if I don't, you have the handout to turn to. So to begin with, we decided, being a group of graduate students who were speakers of various languages, that we wanted to look at creative writing written by adults, and we wanted to have a common, holding the content constant, and the way to do that was to work with translation. So we picked a widely translated book, The Hobbit, that had been translated in many languages. We picked one chapter, chapter 6, with a lot of movement of humans and wolves and hobbits and eagles, and so there was a lot of motion in there, and we developed a way of coding motion event in these novels, and I will show you what we discovered from this translation study, which eventually I published in a Festschrift in honor of Ruth Berman. Here we had a collection of satellite-framed languages, English, Germanic and Slavic, and of verb-framed languages, Romance, Hebrew, and Turkish. And if you look just at the number of types, so the actual individual lexical items, number of types of manner verbs that were used. In the Tolkien's original English, he uses 26 different types of manner verbs. And if you look across the translations, the mean value is also about 26. If you look at the verb-framed languages, on the whole, the mean value is only 17. So a lot of these manner verbs are not being translated. And Italian stands out in being a little higher, not as high as the satellite frame languages, and I want to spend a little time talking about why your language is an interesting exception, where you're moving, I think, historically towards being a mixed typology language, or moving towards becoming a satellite frame language, which I think has been happening since late Latin. That's another lecture. So the what we gained from this work was we had to develop a coding scheme that would make it possible to code these dimensions of motion across languages. And I'll just give you a little peek at it. It's all in a digital framework, so we can do automatic searches for any items or combinations of items. For example, an English phrase, creep forward carefully, is coded for a verb of manner, creep, a path expression by a path particle by a directional expression forward, and an adverbial expression of manner, carefully. This should say Dutch, not German, sorry for the error, so that Dutch works exactly the same as English. And if you look at French and Italian, you have a path verb. In French, just a path verb with with a kind of phrase, avec précaution. And in Italian, you have this actual use of a gerundive combination, avanzare strisciando, with also a manner expression, con prudenza. So looking now at another event where you have manner, creeping, direction down with directionality along ground from a source. So you have a lot going on here. It comes out that German keeps all of these things, but the Romance languages make a choice. So in French, they exit the gate and they crawl down the hill, but they have left out part of the description. Portuguese simply has them descend the hill, exiting their portals and so on. But Italian now is this interesting puzzle, because you have these particles which look like satellites, which are not used by the other Romance languages with manner verbs, but you can say, in fact, strisciare fuori, and add giù, so you have an extended path, strisciare fuori del loro portone giù per il pendi. So this led me to think about language contact. Again, showing you how Italian stands out. These are the manner of motions in expressions in chapter 6, where English Tolkien sets this original, and Russian again turns out even higher for other reasons. The Romance languages are always lower, but Italian comes up to the level of Dutch. So something is going on here. And here I will make a quick aside because there's very little time. But on the map of Europe, satellite and verb frame languages meet. And where they meet, in northern Italy, in Switzerland, in Belgium, you have speakers of the two types of languages. And we know that long-term bilingualism leads to grammatical influences between the languages. And if you look at these contact areas, this has been written about a lot. In Northern Italian, you have these expressions that are directly parallel to the German expression. So correre su is exactly parallel to hinaufrennen. You have the same things in Swiss French, where you have the use of ba, like German herunter, and in Belgian French, sauté ba, where you have the ba used like Dutch neerspringen. So language contact is another issue to look at. And here we see the kind of emergence of Italian. English has this vast proliferation of particles. You can go out from, under, down from and across, and so on. But we've seen in Italian you can put these together. You can put together via and giù and so on. So Italian is beginning to make use of its resources to do things that the other Romance languages don't. Okay, I will leave that behind for you to argue about and discuss. But now I was uneasy with the translation task. I said we haven't really given these languages a fair break, because we've given them an English text and say, okay, what will you do in your language to match the English? The real test would be to go to creative fiction writers, novelists who are free to use the resources of their language to do anything they want. And here I expected that all these differences would fall away, because a creative novelist in a verb frame language, I was sure, would find ways to talk about manner of motion, which seems so important to me as an English speaker, and that we were limiting ourselves only to elicited narratives like frog stories or translation tasks. So it was with some trepidation that I did the first comparison, looking at novels written in Spanish, Turkish, English, and Russian in comparison with the frog stories. And if it had turned out that the novels all came up to a high level of manner salience, where the frog stories didn't, then I think this research would have ended and I would have gone somewhere else. But the results were amazing. These are novels, and they match almost perfectly the percentage of motion events using manner verbs as in the frog stories. And again, the Russians are really high for reasons that I won't go into now. So then this led to the next series of studies that still fascinate me, although I haven't done this for many years. The invitation from your laboratory has brought me back to review things that I left many, many years ago. I'm 82 and I retired when I was 65, and since about 2014 I haven't really been doing active academic work, but have been doing many other things that I can talk about informally at another time. So I picked a group of novels in languages that I could read and where I had student assistants who were native speakers of these languages. We picked 10 novels in each language, serious novels, the sort that are reviewed in serious newspapers, written by authors who receive prizes. In each novel, we picked 20 trajectories, and I'll tell you in a minute what a trajectory is. So we had 6 languages, 3 of them from high manner salience languages, 3 of them from low manner salience languages, and that gave us 200 trajectories for each language from 10 different authors. So a trajectory is simple. The instructions where you open a novel, you read until a major protagonist who is not moving starts to move, and you follow that protagonist without interruption, whatever else is happening, until the protagonist arrives at another location where he or she stops and a plot advancing non-motion event occurs. So here are some examples. Oh yeah, and then we coded for all of these components of motion events. And today I will focus just on path, manner, and ground. So you see this is very rich data, which I still use from time to time to pose new research questions. All of these things are available online so people can continue to play with them. So we looked at all of these formal components, all of these motion constructions that I've talked about, and in addition, we wanted to give each language full credit, so we looked for clauses containing any kind of motion relevant information that didn't have a construction actually about motion. So a trajectory can be very simple. This one's from Hemingway. He came into a room, he went to a woman, and then another thing happens. Or a trajectory can be very long. This is one from Hemingway that extended over several pages, where Robert Jordan begins by climbing down and he does many, many things until finally he does something. So trajectories varied in length, and that was independent of language, but it seemed to give each language a fair break. So if we look now at the tokens, the actual individual uses again and again of a manner verb, looking at all of these motion events and say what proportion of them had tokens of manner of motion verbs, the familiar difference between orange and blue holds up, where these are about 50% and these are about 25%. So there's clearly something going on if we measure this way, but I won't say more about this. This shows each of the individual authors, and you see that even the verb-framed authors who use the highest proportions just come to the level of the lower level of the satellite frame verb authors. So you have sort of two walls here. You have the orange wall, which is much higher, going all the way up to this high Russian column, and you have the blue ranks, which are always lower. But you see that there are individual differences in each language, that authors vary in their style. So we're studying, we can go into rhetorical style in detail using these measures. If we look now just at the types, the actual lexical items, we again get the same distinction in number of actual manner verb types in each of these languages. So these are the 59 English types that we got from these novels, and you can see it's this familiar group of very fine distinctions. So we have a densely packed semantic space in English, 59 types, and in comparison, if I can get this to move, yes. In comparison, in Spanish, there are 23 types, and most of these are not very dynamic manners. So andar, caminar, and pasear are simply different ways of saying walk, for example. So then we wanted to give these languages ample opportunity to show that they cared about manner. So we looked at manner expression outside of the verb, these adverbial expressions, sometimes just description of a whole scene, thankful of my slippers that made no sound on the stone flags. From that you can infer a kind of manner of movement. We also added additional information that could suggest the manner of movement, like I was panting, or one shoulder dragged down by the weight of a bag. If you read these things, you can imagine, if you want, the way the protagonist was moving. So if we add all of this, and here I'll just put the two language groups together for, sorry, they end up in the same color in this slide. English, German, and Russian, you've already seen, are higher than Turkish, Spanish, and French. The English take advantage of both of these additions of manner, and they end up even higher, and these languages also take advantage of it, and they end up just at the level of the English speakers. And if I get to the description of motion events eventually, I will claim that English speakers use extensions to increase, to make the already existing dynamic manner more dynamic, whereas verb-framed languages use these additional means to create manner expressions that they didn't have otherwise. So there's a difference in the whole use of no, don't go there. Sorry, I'm talking to my computer that is sometimes recalcitrant. Okay, now this is putting me back at the beginning. Sorry, folks, this is an unconventional format for my computer. So I have to get back to where I was. Okay, this I've talked about codability, but now looking at text, at novels that my students are gathering from many languages, it was clear that there are we go beyond typology totally. Languages have other means of talking about manner. So there's verb compounding, which is frequently used in Japanese and Korean. You can, for example, in Japanese, put together verbs with a conjoining particle te, and so you can have flutter, descend, tekur, flutter, descend, and come. Japanese and Korean, which are remarkably similar, although unrelated, have exactly the same form possibilities. Japanese makes rich use of them, Korean doesn't. So my Korean student, Kyung-Ju Oh, says the vividness of manner expressions in the English original, this was on The Hobbit, seems to be lost in the Korean translation. So languages differ than rhetorical choices that have to do with culture or literary style, which is a whole topic now for comparative literature suggested by this research. And I've done some research into medieval literature showing that some of the differences between Old German and Old French romances can actually be described in terms of accessibility of manner. Then we discovered languages, when you listen to them, recording them, who have ideophones. So some languages love them. There are whole dictionaries of them. In Basque, salik is quietly, or Japanese, doya doya, noisily. And we found ideophones also all over in West Africa and in Austronesian and Japanese. And in Japanese, there are whole lexicons of ideophones. And then the frog story in my Tseltal Mayan, gathered by Penny Brown from Nijmegen, have a huge set of posture verbs. And this is where, even though we didn't get full narratives in Mayan, we got picture descriptions of the dog walking with a posture verb, low crouching. Low crouching walking then gives you a manner of movement via positional verbs. So languages have richer ways of being manner salient than just looking at the typology that I began with. And this is another whole topic then of cultural styles of rhetoric. A language like English loves verb descriptivity, and we have manner salience across domains. We have manners of speaking, manners of object destruction, and there are many more ways of going beyond typology. But now I am using my time very rapidly, and I will not tarry at this point, simply to conclude that we now have a cline of manner salience. Languages don't fall just into verb framed or satellite framed. The number of interacting factors that conspire to make manner highly salient, or to make anything else highly salient. And Tommy's original typology was very useful, but it's only one of the factors. This is a sidetrack, again, that I won't go into, that there are consequences for all of the ways in which you describe a scene in narrative, another topic now for comparative literature, comparative rhetoric. But now I think in the remaining time I will only be able to dwell with this. This, to me, is still the most surprising part of all of this research, because it assumed to me, I assumed that once you read or hear a description of an event, you have memory images that simply remain. So I was reading Garcia Marquez in Spanish, Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, and there's people moving back and forth, all kinds of dramatic scenes. And when I looked at the Spanish text, there was hardly any suggestion in the use of verbs, but still I had these images, and I assumed that any Spanish reader would have the same images. To my surprise, it was very different. So I created this task where the participant would read a passage from a novel and then tell you what mental imagery occurred to them. I took Spanish novels where you could infer manner of motion even though it wasn't explicitly expressed. And I had English monolinguals who read an exact translation. It turns out I couldn't use the literary translations because English translators, when they translate a Spanish novel, add a whole bunch of manner verbs because otherwise it wouldn't read like a good English novel. So I had to make exact translations. Spanish monolinguals would read the original, and I had Spanish-English bilinguals who would read both. And the instructions were to retell the scene in as much detail as you can. Imagine you're telling a filmmaker and an actor how to translate your description into a movie that would play in the scene exactly as you saw it in your mind. So this was focusing on mental imagery. And here is one of the events from Isabel Allende, Casa de los Espíritus, House of the Spirits. And the protagonist has to go along a path, and all that Allende tells you is that he had a walk, so he's walking, and the path has mud and stones, and he does this with great difficulty because he has heavy suitcases. And we asked people to talk about their mental imagery. English readers report using all of these manner verbs. I see someone who's staggering, trudging, hobbling. Spanish-speaking readers in Chile reading a novel written in their native language by a Chilean novelist still astound me. I do not understand how they could read this and come to this conclusion. This is a Chilean reader who says, no lo observo moverse, I don't see him move, sino como imágenes estáticas más como fotografías, like static images, like photographs. I can't imagine reading that scene and having a mental image just with a series of static photographs. But I got this again and again from Spanish speakers. So I then turned to Mexican-American students in Berkeley because we have a large bilingual population. A student read this in Spanish and said the same thing. No miro ninguna clase de acción detallada de parte de él. I don't see any sort of detailed action. And this part amazed me. It would seem that he were floating as if he were seated in a cart. How could you read mud and stones of a path, carrying heavy suitcases, and end up with a mental image of floating? So clearly, if you're a Spanish reader, or maybe also an Italian reader, you know that, you pay attention to the ground, the scenery, the general direction of the path, and you are actually building a different scene in your mind. The same student read it in English and said, I see more concrete walking and I can sort out on a pace. I see less of the surroundings, less detail in regards to the scenery. So this student reading the same words in English rather than Spanish had her attention directed more to the walking and less to the surroundings, which I find astounding. Then if we'll skip ahead, you can see in your handout this was repeated with Puerto Rican speakers with the same kind of findings. Now, so what are the consequences for this? Again, I can't see what the slide says, but the consequences are most of what we know about the world, we hear from other people, or we read about it, or we hear about it on the radio or news broadcasts. And even if you're watching a video clip on a news broadcast, you're hearing what the commentator says. And in fact, we found looking at news broadcasts in different countries that actual different video clips are selected. So much of what you end up in representation is information that you received verbally through language. And from that you form mental images, and people very quickly forget the exact words they were told. You have left in your mind this memory full of content, of mental images, and then you make judgments later, evaluating people, describing people, elaborating, whatever. It turns out that this is a very old tradition in the history of experimental psychology. This is a classic study carried out by Beth Loftus, who then became known for the reliability of memory. This was a very early study. People were shown a film in which two cars collide, and the viewer was asked to estimate how fast the cars were going, and different sets of viewers were asked with different verbs. How fast were they going when they smashed into each other, collided with each other, or contacted each other? And they estimated their speed. Notice they had seen the same video clip. They had a mental image of it afterwards. When they were asked this question, their estimates of speed were different. If you were asked how fast were they going when they smashed, you remembered them moving at a higher speed than contacted. So already in this early psychological research, there was clear influence of mental imagery on evaluation. And then there was a wonderful part of this experiment. There was a surprise. The participants were brought back a week later, and they were said, "Did you see any broken glass in that film, by the way?" And there had been no broken glass in this film clip of the accident. But while I'm searching for the slide, well, you see it, but I'm sure you can predict what the result would be. If you had been told a week earlier that they had smashed together, you were more likely to think that there was broken glass versus if you'd just been told that they had hit. So this now has huge consequences for the courtroom, for forensic linguistics, because we rely on what a witness or a defendant says in order to decide what really happened, and is that person guilty or innocent. So I see I should not have animated these texts, but you can see them all, I believe. So this is a study that Luna Filipovic and I did. In California, we have access to legal records after the case is decided, and we have court testimony and interpreters in about 50 different languages. It's a very multilingual state. And we dealt with Spanish, where we could look at what the original defendant or witness said in Spanish and what the judge and jury heard from the court interpreter. And we found, again, this difference in manner of motion. We also looked at other things that I won't talk about now in terms of agency and causality. But this is just one witness describing an event of a robbery of a fast food place called Carl's Jr. And the witness is trying to be very non-committal. Simply says, "se metió," he placed himself. The interpreter said he ran into Carl's Jr., even though the witness did not say he ran into, but in English, you can't say he put himself into it, and you wouldn't say, you could say he went into, but the interpreter is making, probably unconsciously, a judgment based on the interpreter's assessment of the witness. And he then simply says, "salió," and the interpreter says he ran, again, adding manner. And the only manner that the witness tells you is that "se fue montar en carrera," in a rush. "Y se fue," and he went away. So he got into the car in a rush and went away, and the interpreter says the other guy ran and jumped in the car quickly. So what can be the consequences? And Filipovic concludes in her discussion, we would get the impression that the event itself was placed much faster if we read the English translation. And so you draw different conclusions from what the witness said in the Spanish original and the English translations, and the judge and jury never have any access to this issue. Now, if I started looking at newspaper reports and looking at reports of the very same incident, for example, in English and German versus French and Spanish, the events were more dynamic in English and German, which suggests the decisions you would make for the next action if you are involved in the situation or judging guilt or responsibility and so on. So it now has deeper and deeper implications for how we understand news. So I do have time to zip into the very last method I want to tell you about, because I want to tell you about tools. This is eliciting descriptions of events in order to map the density of semantic fields, another way of tapping into manner salience. With a group of undergraduates, we went around and took video clips of people doing normal things in the world. I don't have the clips here, just a screenshot. So this was a clip of two people walking along in a relaxed way. This was a man walking back and forth as if he was thinking in a hallway. And in English, and you ask people just to say, describe this clip in English, you would get verbs like walk and stroll for this scene, but pace for that screen. Whereas in Spanish, pasear was used for both situations. So if you look across now a whole bunch of screens we use, of video clips we use, where Spanish uses three simple verbs of walking, andar, caminar, and pasear, English uses a huge set, and you can see they're distributed by different kinds of walking. So pace pace and walk can describe the same scene, but pace and step or mope don't describe the same scene. The Spanish have only one verb of impaired walking, cojear, but in English that relates to both limping and hobbling. So this was the design. Now I want to show you how we analyze this in fact. So this was with Iraide Ibarrecha Antuniano, who was a native speaker of Spanish and Basque, Aneta Kopecka, speaker of Polish and French, and Asra Majid, whom you will hear from in a few weeks, is the magician who knew how to see patterns in all of these data that we gathered. So we had research done, this was all done in Nijmegen, but with native speakers in Spain of Spanish and Basque, in Poland of Polish, and in Lyon of French, and in Berkeley. And we had 24 clips of everyday motion. And for each one, they lasted about 10 seconds. They were shown twice, and we were asked, the participant was asked to name the type of motion with a single verb as specifically as possible. If there's more than one verb, write them separately, and if you need to describe more, do so in the space provided, and simply answer the question, what is he doing? So if you just look at the number of manner verbs provided per participant, the satellite framed languages, these familiar color contrasts, provide a larger and more diverse set of manner verbs, English and Polish. Again, the Slavic language comes out high, versus French, Spanish, and Basque. And here's where Asra Majid did this marvels for us using both MDS analysis and hierarchical clustering analysis. So the huge data matrices exist of each video clip and each verb that was used to describe that video clip. And then you take each verb and say what other video clips were described by this verb. And then using MDS similarity measures, you get a similarity space showing which scenes fall together and which scenes are described by different types of verbs. And Asra produced this complicated, beautiful path. The names here are just our mnemonics to remember what the event was. The only thing in the data was the clip number 11 or clip number 19. And they clustered very clearly. These set of clips were described by verbs that were never used by these set of clips. These set of clips were described by verbs like run, jog, sprint. This is sort of a running space in semantic space. And these were words like walk and trudge and wander. These are situations described by walking verbs. And we know from perceptual recognition experiments that the motor patterns involved in walking and running are perceptually distinct. They're two different motor patterns, and there's a clear break from one to the other. And here, the elicited naming task reveals the same dimensions, and we have the dimension here seems to be a kind of, within these, a kind of velocity dimension. So sprint is faster than jogging, and strut is faster than hobbling, and so on. We had one little cluster because we happened to have two scenes of a child creeping or crawling, and that was four-dimensional motion that was just over here. And then we had a strange collection that I call non-canonical or syncopated movement, and then two connections there, skipping, galloping, which is kind of bounce and recall, punctuated, syncopated, irregular movement, as opposed to up and down movement, jumping. And you can see that you could pick different collections of videos and get different semantic fields. I won't show you the hierarchical cluster analysis, which provided similar findings, but more dimensions. So using hierarchical cluster analysis, we found these dimensions of posture, rate, rhythm, and force dynamics. Again, we wanted to see what options languages had besides the actual verbs. So we looked at modifying expressions, and we found, as I suggested earlier, that in English and Polish that already are highly manner salient, they used modifying expressions to make expressive manner verbs even more expressive. So striding is already moving very confidently, and putting stride confidently makes it seem somehow even more expressive. Whereas French, Spanish, and Basque use modifying expressions essentially to create manner verbs from basic verbs. So if you take the basic verb andare, walk, and you say andare de forma suave, you are adding a particular kind of manner, so that in the verb frame languages, in describing these clips, you sort of add a basic level of manner expressivity, whereas in the satellite frame languages, you add a higher level of manner expressivity. Okay, that's what I just said. Oh yes, and I have a moment at the end to leave you a little time for discussion. Is study of eye movement, and I will skip the last study, which is study of memory for features of movement, because I'd rather leave you some time for questions. This is back to eye movements, work that I didn't do, work done in Lyon and Lille by Eva Soroli and Maya Hickman, where they were interested in the same topics, but using eye movements, where they had cartoons. It's hard to see from their publication. This is a cartoon of a bear climbing up a tree towards a beehive. Obviously, the bear wants to get to the honey. And if you ask people to describe these scenes in English and French, you got the familiar description of the bear climbs up the tree, or the bear ascends the tree. But the exciting thing to me is, like the Heidelberg and Amsterdam research, they showed these cartoon sequences to people without any task, just saying, look at this and we will discuss it later. Now you could study the eye movements all the way up. The English eye movements go up this way, this arrow I've added to their data. So the eye movements follow the moving legs and the direction all the way up. They're following both path and manner, the legs moving up to the top. The French eye movements glance at these little legs and then just look at the trajectory of the bear, the back of the bear moving up to the top. So it's clear that the French pay minimum attention to manner and they say, okay, that doesn't matter. The bear is ascending the tree, whereas the English speakers say, what's happening is the bear is climbing up the tree. Okay, I will stop here and not talk about the last slide, and thank you for being patient to being forced to pay attention to a huge amount of information in English that probably went too rapidly, but I did fit within the time zone. So, Francesca, I turn it back to you.
Here we are. A lot of clapping.
I don't hear it, but I will bow.
So it was very, very dense and
Yes.
Very interesting. I found it really stimulating, a lot of, interesting issues.
That's why I hope you all have handouts with references, and I encourage you, as I said, to email with me if you want to really probe any of these things in detail.
Sure, but let's see if there is any question. So you can raise your hand on Teams, or you can write your question on the chat and I will read it for you. Don't be shy. Okay, let's see. Okay, there is one long question. Okay, Esther, don't you want to speak up and say it yourself? Or do you want me to read it?
Good evening. Actually, it's better if you read it because my connection is not very stable. So thank you very much if you could read it.
Of course, I will.
Thank you, Francesca.
You're welcome, Esther. Okay, so good evening, Professor Slobin. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight. As an Italian native speaker who became fluent in Turkish at the age of 27, I've always been interested in the way the Turkish language distinguishes between past tense, that Turkish speakers used to talk about past events that they are witnessed, and reported past tense, Mish, I hope, that is used in reporting events that the speaker didn't witness.
Yeah, I can answer directly because, in fact, I've done a lot of research on that, and so have my Turkish students, Ayhan Aksukoç and Aylin Kuntay, who have gone on to become professors in Turkey. And yes, Turkish has an obligatory past tense marking for evidentiality, whether you are reporting something you witnessed yourself or something that you infer from here because you heard about it, or you make an inference from the end state. And in fact, this permeates how Turkish speakers remember and report events, how children learn to report events. And in fact, as the questioner, I don't know who you are, has probably noticed, it influences how you speak Italian. I find that my Turkish-speaking friends who are fluent English speakers will say things like, it seems that such and such, or apparently he went such and such. And I found that when I've been speaking Turkish for a while, I start putting in more of those markers. And again, in the language contact study, where I've studied Turkish in contact with Slavic languages in the Balkans, with Iranian languages on the eastern border, these languages create an evidential marking. So you have obligatory evidential marking in Bulgarian past tense, but not in any other Slavic language. And the same thing happens in reverse in the Andes in Latin America, where the indigenous Inca languages, Aymara and Quechua, have marking like Turkish mish, obligatory marking of evidentiality, and Spanish speakers of Andean Spanish, el español andino, have restructured Spanish to use the past perfect as an obligatory evidential marking. So in that Spanish, if you say ella había ido, it doesn't mean she had gone, it means she went inferentially, as in the Inca languages.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Checking the chat. Let's see. Okay, I see a hand. Chiara Gianollo.
Good evening. I hope you hear me well.
Yes, hello.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation of so much material. It's really difficult, of course, to formulate one question. So I decided to ask something that will actually be very useful to me, which relates to ongoing research. I was very interested in the aspect that you showed about the difficulty of using the same tool across cultures and languages. So when you were talking about the frog story, and you were saying that sometimes the comparability of data is really hindered by the fact that in some cultures they're not used to dealing with picture books. And so I was wondering, do you think this could have an impact in the kind of research we are doing nowadays to assess, for instance, linguistic competencies and proficiency in heritage language perspective? Because we use this kind of standardized instruments, but then we are comparing, especially with very young children who are in preschool age, are just so we are, for instance, measuring their school readiness, as they say. This aspect of pre-literacy, of dealing with narrations and dealing with extracting a narrative from pictures might be extraneous to them. So we might put them in a position that already has an impact on the kind of results we will get. For instance, we want to investigate anaphoric chains. And so this ability, so the tool we use could really have a big impact on the kind of data we obtain. So what would you do? What do you think about the possibility of adopting this tool in this kind of multilingual research?
Yeah, you're quite right. I've thought about that too. Ruth Berman has developed another technique of eliciting narrations, things that children are likely to talk about. Was there a fight in the playground? Tell me about it. So you get different narrations from different children, but you have the same kind of content where they're speaking in their own way. And then you can, in fact, study anaphora and deixis, because you can say, wait, he did that to him, but which one do you mean? So you can probe it that way. Another technique that she has used is to give people a situation that they describe and ask them to evaluate it. So you're dealing verbally, where you've presented some story to them, a disagreement, an argument, an event, and they say, well, what do you think of this? And should he have done this? And where do you think they went afterwards? So you can elicit more natural speech. And in fact, from these spontaneous narrations, we get much richer data in terms, especially as you were saying, of anaphora, deixis, perspective shift.
Do you think we reach the same level of standardization, even if, of course, the kind of space they can move across in deciding their own narrative is, of course, bigger?
I think that's a challenge, of course, but if you have then a way of coding these texts to say this is a situation of two participants where they were mutually engaged, for example, then you can pull out all of those situations as opposed to events where there was one teacher talking to a group of children or whatever. It's more difficult, but if you have a lot of data, I think that can be done.
Okay, thank you so much.
But I think this topic is extremely important. It's important not only all over Europe, but we have huge immigrant populations in California. In fact, English is a minority language in California if you put together all of the other languages spoken in California.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Chiara. Any more questions? Doubts? Concerns? I was very concerned about the question about the consequences for a courtroom. I never thought of that, actually. It's very serious. I mean, you managed to raise the issue of the social impact of the studies on typology of motion.
Really. Yeah, and especially now with refugees seeking asylum, where they have to tell a story in their native language, and the immigration officer has to say, well, it would not be safe for you to go back to your country. And there have been really important studies ongoing now in linguistic anthropology, studying, in fact, that situation of the gatekeeper at the border and the immigrant testimony that has to be translated.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I never thought of that. It's really,
no, it's true.
really...
I once met the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court at an academic reception, and I told him about this. And he said, oh, we were totally unaware of this. Please send me some papers. So yes, it's something where the courts and the border officials simply assume, well, whatever the translator tells me is the information. And now think about what happens in diplomatic agreements. So we were told that Biden and Putin spent an hour together, but it meant that they spent a half an hour together. Their interpreters were speaking for the other half hour, and the Russian interpreter and the American interpreter are deciding how to present something to the other side. And you'd say, how are diplomatic negotiations ever even possible?
Right. So, no more hands.
Well, I look forward to email correspondence. And as I told Francesca before the meeting, what I miss is the time afterwards to just hang out and talk with all of you and have some good wine and Italian food. So to reward myself this evening, because it's only morning now, my son and I are going to go out to have an Italian dinner together to a very fine Italian restaurant called Agrodolce. And as I said to Francesca at the beginning, it's because it's been dolce to be with you, but agro not to be face to face. So thank you for this opportunity to meet you remotely.
It was really, really super interesting. I'm sure that you will receive a lot of follow-up emails and questions and everything. It was really, really a pleasure.
And thank you to you for making it possible, you and your co-workers, and for struggling together with me and our California and Bologna systems to make these systems talk to each other. It was not easy, as you know.
Not easy, but we succeeded, and that's what matters. But next time, then it will be in presence in Bologna with true tortellini and everything else.
Con piacere.
Exactly. Thank you very much again, and thank you to everyone who attended this workshop. Thank you.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Thank you.